Hey, Ms. Vaughn, how's it going?
It's going good, Miss Dixon.
All right. So, I guess the purpose of this conversation is to talk about the data that you all received from the mock milestones. We took a mock test a few weeks ago, and we got some data back, and so I wanted to kind of have a conversation with you around what we can do to over the next few weeks to remediate and accelerate students on using the data we received to prepare them for the GMAS, which is coming up in a few weeks. Okay, so as we have this conversation, I'll be jotting some notes down, so don't mind me. I'm just gonna ask you a few questions, and then the goal is to develop a plan. Again, for remediation, reteaching and remediation over the next few weeks, and then after that, we'll come back and kind of see. We'll give another formative or quick check, summative assessment to determine growth and whether or not the strategies and things we put in place work. So, all right, you good with that?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so just real quick, looking at your overall data, just at a bird's eye view, just talk to me about how you feel about it overall so far.
Well, just from looking at the data, overall, I noticed that most of my kids still kind of fell in that beginning category. I would definitely love to move them up to proficient where for this assessment, I only had 4 students out of 36 to perform at the proficient level, which means I still have some work to do in terms of preparing them for the Georgia Milestones assessment.
All right, you said beginning category. How many how many kids total?
It was 36 students in all.
And how many did you have at beginning?
24 were beginning. I have 8 that were developing and 4 that were proficient.
Okay. And was that everybody, all of the kids that you teach?
Yes, for that course, yes.
Okay. So everybody, you had 100% participation rate?
Yes.
Okay, good deal. All right. So, yeah, we definitely have some work to do in that area. I think us taking the mock milestones as early as we did gave us some good information on some of the weak spots that we need to make sure we address. Now, what I can say is because we took the test a little early, and we know you guys are still teaching some standards, that gives us some additional value information on whether or not some of the information we taught, how far we need to go and how deep we need to go, and that would definitely help us save some time. So I first want to talk about the strengths, right? So it was a 38 question test aligned to the GMAS. What were some of the strengths you noticed in the student data?
From domain 2, the Constitution and Early Republic, that was one of the higher domains from that assessment.
Okay, you said domain 2, and that was something we taught at the beginning of the year, right?
Yes.
Okay. You said Constitution and Republic?
Yes.
Okay. And so I think I remember looking at that test. There were about 7 questions over that domain. So, and that is information that we taught, I would say maybe the beginning of the first 9 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to do kudos, to give you some kudos there, because that does show evidence of spiraling and making sure that information is relevant and on the table, stays on the table for kids.
Mm-hmm.
So kudos to you on that. All right, so we know our and I just want to encourage you to keep spiraling, right? Don't keep those questions on the conveyor belt. Make sure that when you give your bell ringers, when you do your ticket out of the doors, when you continue to teach new content and introduce new content, that you continue to expose kids to those types of questions that fall in that domain to ensure that we don't lose that information. Okay? All right, so I think you did a good job identifying strengths and content, right? So I want you to go to your item analysis tab.
Mm-hmm.
And I want you to sort by item type.
Okay.
And then I want to kind of talk about where we see gaps in the data as it relates to particular item types. I know a lot of our conversation this year has been making sure, has been with you guys, has been to make sure that we expose kids to all the various item types. What we've been seeing a lot in our earlier formative assessments was one type of item, which is the traditional multiple choice. So let's look at that item analysis and kind of talk about that and where we see some strengths and weaknesses there.
Okay. So definitely see strengths in students being able to just answer our traditional items, which are your multiple choice items. Like, it looks like at least 80 to 60% of the students were able to get those answers correct.
Mm-hmm.
But then, as I filtered more through the data, we definitely see that students did not answer any of the drag and drop questions.
Okay.
So is there a issue with students being able to manipulate that tool while they're taking the assessment, or did they just not know how to answer the questions correctly? I'm also seeing with the drop down items, we only had 11% of those students to get that item correct. Multiple response. So that I would definitely say the technology enhanced items kids may need more practice with, because that's where the data begins to drop off tremendously.
Okay.
Multiple choice items they got, but anything dealing with drop down, drag and drop, multiple response, this is where the data is.
It's dropping off.
Yeah.
How often do y'all practice with those type of items when you do your formative assessments?
Not often, so that's something that I definitely can probably go and use with formative, or either put some short assessment items in School City where kids have to practice with those different technology enhanced item tools.
Okay, so if you're just needing items, if you're like struggling with finding items that align to those particular item types, remember you also have the Georgia Online Experience platform.
Okay.
So that kids can kind of manipulate and just interact with those items. But formative is also a good tool to build those items in. And then go back to some of your earlier assessments, and you have from in School City, you do have access to those items that have been added, so that kids can manipulate those. And then I'm also gonna remind you of Progress Learning. Also has the different item types, and you can filter to specifically pick certain types of items so that kids can practice. So I think
definitely start doing that.
Okay, good deal. So I think you had some good strategies in terms of making sure we're exposing kids to the right items and building on their strengths, but also enhancing their weaknesses as it relates to the item types. But I want to kind of go look at content specific things that we know kids struggle with, right? And so going back to the content specifically, we know our two heaviest weighted domains are domains 4 and 5. And so I want you to kind of just talk to me about where you saw the data falling in terms of the weak spots for students.
We'll start with the Cold War first. According to the data, this was something that the kids struggled with. A lot of it could have been because they might have had to analyze some things or explain their thoughts dealing with the Korean War, Marshall Plan. So those were definitely some areas where I saw challenges.
Okay. So you said Marshall Plan, all those standards related to the Cold War. Okay, so I want to talk about, I was here maybe a week ago. And I think you were kind of focused, your lesson was centered around the domestic and international policies that fall under Standard 20, right? And so I do want to point out, we're making sure to remind you that when you are planning your lessons, to make sure that you are really looking at the intent of the standard, right? Your students were analyzing some excerpts from speeches, some speech excerpts from various leaders during that time period. And what I noticed was, although those speeches aligned to those particular events, the Cold War, in particular the Marshall Plan, and the Truman Doctrine, they didn't hit the intent of the standard. And so you got to think when we ask questions, because there's a lot of information they can know about the Truman Doctrine, there's a lot of information they can learn about the Marshall Plan, but that standard specifically wanted kids to know how they related to containment and post World War II containment. And so I think when you're planning your lessons, using your success criteria and your learning target will really help drive your lesson planning, so that you can make sure the resources you're pulling push the intent of the standard, and we're just not out there in left field talking about everything related to the Truman Doctrine, because I know we are social studies teachers and we want people to know all the things, right? And some of that stuff is important for context, but then we get bogged down in it and kind of lose the intent of the standard. So, so we have, I don't want to overload us right now, because I think we need to kind of chunk. I noticed that you do have some other things on your data analysis as struggles. Let's quickly talk about those, but then I'm going to actually put a plan in place for one standard, and then we can kind of come back to the table and talk. So let's just talk about identify some other challenge areas quickly, and then we'll come back specifically to standard 20.
So civil rights movement, you had economic policies, and modern U.S.
Okay. There's a lot of information embedded in those standards. And have y'all gotten to this yet?
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
So that could have been part of the reason why my data didn't look good in those areas, because we have not made it that far yet in the curriculum.
Okay. So let's go back in particular, talk about standard 20 and some of the things and strategies we could put in place. So we're just gonna focus on one domain for our targeted review, right, which is next week. And because this is a heaviest weighted domain, do you think it would do us some justice to focus on which standard do you think we should focus on to really get the bang for our buck for this remediation time? We're gonna do remediation Wednesdays. So you'll have extended time on Wednesdays to work with your kids, from talking to the coach, as well as admin. They kind of carved out some time for you to really focus in on what kids need. So what's our area of focus again for that remediation?
The Cold War, which is SSUS age 20.
And so, talk to me about some of the things you plan to do, some of the strategies you plan to implement as it relates to, are we just going to whole group reteach? We going to small group? Like, what do you?
Well, first I can look at my data, and from my data, I should be able to create groups. So like, identifying those students who struggled with these particular standards. And so that would be the first group that I would probably start with. And from listening to you earlier, just making sure that the items that I'm remediating with them really align to the intent of the standard and the success criteria. Because maybe some of the teaching maybe went off a little bit, so I need to go back and comb back through that to make sure that the information that we're going over with the students is matches the intent of the standard and the success criteria. I can also use some comparison charts and historical scenarios so that students can be able to look at the containment efforts and identify which ones were more effective and why.
Okay. And I think that's part of that inquiry. Like, I love that you came up with the idea of using the historical charts, because when we talk about inquiry and social studies, that's how you get kids engaged, right? The Truman Doctrine, containment, and Marshall Plan, all of that's so ancient to them. So I love the fact that you brought in using those. You said historical scenarios. So I want you to also look at places where you can kind of bring in some real world examples, because there is so much going on right now in international policy under President Trump's administration that directly ties to a lot of the conflict, especially when we look at what's happening with Taiwan and Ukraine and how we deal with international policy, the issues in terms of not necessarily containing communism at this point, but just kind of a battle between democracy and communist-like or autocratic-style government. So it's a lot happening right now that you can use to bring in. I also heard you say you were going to look at the data, so you're grouping the students by need, which is what we need to do. And I'm just going to also say this. I appreciate you coming in and being open. A lot of times we get in defense when the data doesn't come back the way we want it. But you've kind of taken ownership of the data. You have received the feedback. You've already done the data analysis before I even told you that was the focal point of our conversation today. So you already understand the importance of combing through and digging through the data. I think the next step is just to put that remediation plan in place. And then we'll do a quick reassessment or just a few questions. I'll work with Ms. Jones to get those assessment items identified, and you guys will come up with a day to retest. And then after that retest, we'll come back and look at the data to see how our strategies were implemented and whether it was impactful or not. Okay. All right. So again, thank you for being open. I know sometimes you have a district in your building and these difficult conversations. It's kind of hard for us to navigate. But again, I thank you for being open, and I'll see you maybe in about a week or so. Okay.
Thank you.